Chapter 20 The Insider. Glissa was amazed at the coordination and cooperation on display between the Leonin and Goblin soldiers as they scrambled this way and that, setting up defensive positions. The rumbling had subsided, though she suspected it might start up again at any minute. Yikshar barked orders, keeping a level head amidst the organized chaos. Lies, Glissa observed, was strapping on a sword belt. The elf girl examined her own ancient sword in the orange firelight. There still wasn't a nick or scratch anywhere on it. Elven weapons were made to last. "Brenna," Glissa said, "none of this is going to work if I don't get to Yert." "And to the guard said vampires. I know," Brenna replied, fumbling with one of the pouches on her belt. "He's here. I can sense him." Glissa closed her eyes, attempting to reach out to the energies of the tangle. "I can too," the elf girl said with a surprise. "He's like a void, and something else. Constructs. They're making my spine tingle." Brenna nodded in agreement. "Focus on Yert. The Miracore should lead you right to him." The Nurok mage produced chains strung with a trio of different colored gemstones and placed it in the elf girl's hand. The mage explained that each one was infused with a specific magic and keyed to Glissa's voice. Brenna had prepared them that morning. The green one would transport her instantly to a location she named 3 times while holding the stone to her lips. Using the same method, the red one would return Glissa to Krark, and the blue one would give her the ability to fly for a short time. Alone among the 3 stones, the blue flight gem could be used as often as Glissa wished, Brenna explained with a hint of pride. Glissa thanked her, wrapped the chain around her forearm like a bracelet, and tucked the valuable stones up the long sleeve of her silver Leonin tunic. "I need to stay and defend Krark, or this may be all over before it begins," Brenna added. "And you must leave for the interior as soon as you retrieve the Miracore. You must retrieve the Miracore. I shall help you with Yert as much as I can, but then you must go. Use the stones." "Oh, I'll get the Miracle," Glissa said, still gazing at her sword. "If I have to take Yert's head off for it." She placed a hand on Brenna's shoulder and looked over at Lies, who was still preoccupied with weapons and armor. "Afterward, tell her I'll be back soon. No time for a long goodbye." Glissa didn't add that she wouldn't be able to make herself leave. Despite the dire circumstances, if her sister was fighting for her life at the same time. Yikshar had already joined the battle, and Lies would not be able to avoid it. "I shall, but now we go," Brenna said quietly. "Remember, Yert is the goal. Until you have the Miracore, only fight whatever's blocking your way." Brenna turned and headed out one of the dining room's many exits, sparing one last glance at her sister, so changed in such a short period of time. Glissa followed without a word. Lias looked up with her one good eye just in time to see the older elf girl's booted foot disappear around the bend in the passage, and she set off after them. The goblin tunnels that honeycombed the Oxida Mountains were a complicated network of twists, turns, intersections, and more than one path to nowhere. Cavernous ventilation chimneys appeared at odd intervals, and a few deep pits opened here and there along the way. Unlike the chasm Glissa had crossed while hunting Yert 5 years ago, these pits ended in bubbling or ang-smelling pools, part of the ongoing volcanic process that continually reshaped the Oxida range. The goblins had learned to harness that power, but held deep respect for it. The tunnels led to several secret entrances and exits, which were not always the same thing, Glissa had learned. And the main entrance was moved by magic every few days just to be safe. The Nims seemed to be in every tunnel at once. It didn't take long for Glissa and Brenna to meet the first wave of invaders. The elf god had hoped that they might catch up with Yikshar, but the Kar and his men had apparently taken another tunnel. Glissa felt the empty void of Yert's presence, and the tingling hum of what could only be the Miracore was in this direction. The hulking black shapes of Nim warriors filled the tunnel ahead of them. "I'd say they're blocking our way," Glissa said. "Indeed," Brenna agreed. The mage closed her eyes momentarily and moved her hands in simple patterns. A wall of quicksilver materialized over the pair, blocking the Nim and the rest of the tunnel from view. "How are we supposed to—" Glissa began. Brenna raised one finger to her blue lips and flung her other hand forward as if hurling a stone. The quicksilver wall shimmered, and a shivering circular dent appeared in the center. As Glissa watched, the dent folded in on itself, and then opened inwards, forming a long, glowing silver tunnel, just large enough for a crouching human and elf to fit through single file. The long cylinder ended perhaps 100 feet ahead. "This will get us past the first group," Brenna said softly, sweat appearing on her brow as the quicksilver solidified. Finally she exhaled, and urged Glissa forward. Glissa expected the magical metal to be slippery, but her boots found solid surface. She bounded down the tunnel, her sword held in front of her. Brenna followed close behind. Glissa looked back over her shoulder and saw that the entrance was closing in behind them as they ran, preventing unwelcome pursuit. At the exit ahead, Glissa saw a pair of pale humanoid shapes, standing crouched ready to pounce. "Vampires," the elf girl cried over her shoulder, pointing. She heard Brenna mutter the beginnings of another spell as the vicious creatures stepped into the quicksilver tunnel. They looked even more ghastly than usual in the eerie magical light. "Just keep running," Brenna said. "Get past them, they're in for a surprise." Glissa raised her sword in both hands as she was about to bring it down on the head of the lead vampire, which she was sickened to see had the lithe form and distinctive face of an elf. The vampire fell for the bluff and charged at her low to take advantage of what it perceived to be an opening. Instead of following through with her swing, she slapped her other hand onto the chain wrapped around her sword arm. "Fly, fly, fly!" Glissa shouted, then jumped into the air. She was relieved when she didn't come back down, and soared on over the diving creature's head. "Right behind you," she heard Brenna shout. "Keep going." As she shot from the end of the magical tunnel with Brenna hot on her heels, Glissa slowed and looked back. The quicksilver wall shimmered, the surface perfectly smooth. The vampires were nowhere to be seen. "Nice trick," Glissa told Brenna as the mage caught up. "It should hold them long enough for us to get away," Brenna agreed. Together they bobbed and weaved through a surprise group of gnomes and goblins engaged in a life-or-death struggle. Glissa wished she could stop and help the defenders, but Brenna was right. Yert was all that mattered. In the end, getting her hands on the Miracore would save a lot more people than just one sword in the fray. "We're getting close," Brenna said. "I can't believe he's made it this far into Krark. The pair veered off in a freeway intersection where Leonin and goblins were knocking an unending wave of Nim into the smelting pools below. Brenna steered them up a rising path that Glissa noticed was more brightly lit than the rest. It was also strangely empty. "I don't like this." "I know where this tunnel leads," Brenna said. "Where?" Glissa asked, ducking to avoid a hanging copper stalactite. "The nurseries." The higher up the tunnel they went, the closer Yert felt. Glissa no longer needed to concentrate to feel the vampire necromancer. The tunnel ended just ahead. They had yet to encounter anyone in the passage, friend or foe. Brenna and Glissa slowed and pulled up short, hovering just in front of a set of double doors that the elf girl would have to duck to get through. Brenna shook the door latch, but it wouldn't budge. "I've got an idea," Glissa said. "Stand back." She floated back a few feet, and then reached out to the tangle energies, calling on the strength of the forest. She felt a surge of physical power, and felt her armor and tunic tighten around her muscles. Glissa felt strong enough to take the top off of the mountain with her bare hands. Brenna, impressed, floated alongside. Glissa clenched her fist and flew straight at the door, fists held in front of her, a living projectile. Halfway there, and she heard Geth scream. The elf girl's gloved fist connected dead center and shattered the crystalline-looking mechanism, sending the small iron door flying inwards with a tremendous crash. She plowed headlong into the stunned vampire. Glissa's fists drove straight through the creature's torso like a hot knife through lead. She kept going, willing herself onwards, and ripped the vampire in two. Greenish-black gore blinded the elf momentarily. When this was over, she was going to bathe in hot oil for a week. "Stop!" a familiar, slithering voice bellowed. Glissa whirled in midair to face the voice and wiped foul, stringy goop from her eyes. Yert stood in the center of the room, flanked by a quartet of vampires. He stood over a pair of Leonin corpses in blood-stained white robes. Tiny figures, human children, goblin kids, and Leonin cubs were huddled in terrified clusters around the wall. Nim warriors blocked every exit except the one Glissa had forcibly opened. In one hand, Yert clutched a crying Leonin cub. In the other, an even smaller goblin infant that wailed and kicked its tiny flapping feet. Yert smiled and showed 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth, and locked his blood-red eyes with Glissa's. As she watched, frozen, he licked his lips with a forked, leathery tongue. Glissa raised her open hands wide and descended until her feet touched the ground. "All right, Yet, you've got me. Again. Put the children down."
"The children are quite safe at the moment," Yert replied. "I can't say the same for the nursemaids."
Glissa felt the chain wrapped around her wrist slide down her arm, and it gave her a terrible idea.
"You will come with me of your own free will," Yert continued. "You showed me mercy once. It was foolish of you, but I can still ever so slightly feel in your debt. You helped make me the man I am today, and you did share that lovely repast with me."
Glissa felt a twinge where there was a wound in her neck. It was not quite healed. Her heart leapt. With Yert's arms spread wide, his robes parted and revealed a sliver of the Miracore in his chest, glowing a faint greenish blue. So close.
"And so I swear, these children and infants will not be harmed if you come with me. Besides, I've discovered I have a bit of a sweet tooth, and you can't enjoy your sweets all at once," Yert hissed.
Glissa nodded, but was doing her best to make eye contact with Brenna, who finally caught her look. Glissa gave an imperceptible nod that Brenna returned faintly. The entire exchange took little over a second, and Yert didn't seem to notice. "I guess that's the best offer I'm going to get," Glissa said, casually lowering her arms and edging her left hand closer to her right. "But what are you going to do with me?" she asked, trying to inject fear into her voice, which wasn't difficult. As Glissa spoke, she rubbed her right wrist with her left hand, as if trying to get the circulation going, but instead was working her fingertips slowly up her arms to her gemstones. "Now, hold on, Yet," she almost drawled. "How do I know you won't... Bruenna, catch the kids! Yert, Yert, Yert!" As the last Yert left her lips, she gulped a deep breath of air. The nursery, Yert, the vampires, and everything else flickered out of existence for a millisecond. When she reappeared, she was inside Yert's body, and Yert's inside suddenly had no place to go. Corroded bone, brackish blood, wiry muscles, fetid tissue, and withered organs exploded violently through Yert's ruptured skin and robes in every direction, tearing his body into tiny chunks of flesh, metal, and blackened bone. The elf girl punched upward, sending what remained of Yert's head flying, then thrust her upturned hands to catch the Miracore before it could hit the ground. She blinked foulness from her eyes for the second time in as many minutes and found herself in the center of a room. A quartet of very surprised vampires, horrified children, and Brenna, who held a blood-spattered, but still healthy pair of infants in her arms, stood gaping. Everything was covered in the stinking bits of Yert. Glissa didn't give the other vampires time to recover. She swung the Miracore like a bludgeon, collapsing the skull of the nearest blood-sucking fiend, which stumbled over backwards and collapsed. The traumatized children scattered and bolted for cover. Glissa shifted her grip and grabbed hold of the heavy chain strung through the artifact and whirled the Miracore over her head like a flail on a very short handle. The chain decapitated the remaining vampires in one clean sweep, and 3 lanky, headless corpses flopped, twitching to the nursery floor. Bet he didn't see that coming, Brenna said, wiping Yert from her eyes and face. Brenna, I didn't see that coming, but it worked, Glissa said. The elf girl gently set down the heavy artifact. She still had work to do. Her sword appeared in her hand, and she stepped forward to face the Nym that blocked the other exits. But she saw they were motionless and silent.
Me, moo, me, moo.
Glissa reached back for Gef's pack, but it wasn't there. She looked over to where she had been standing before teleporting herself inside Yert and saw it rolling lazily back and forth. She ran over to the mumbling bag as Brenna tried to calm the children and herd them away from the Nym and back to safety.
They were still doing the last thing they were told, Gef's head said. Look at them, the beauties.
Brenna, Glissa said, lifting the heavy Miracore aloft. Do you know how to activate this thing? Can we order them to leave? I hope so, Brenna said. She took the heavy asymmetrical disc of the Miracore and held it in 2 hands, and closed her eyes. As the seconds dragged into minutes, Glissa started to wonder if this was really safe. This was godlike power, and Brenna was only human. Finally, the mage blinked. She looked as if she had just walked 100 miles. It's done, Brenna, her voice a croak. As she spoke, the Nym blocking the exits calmly turned and scuttled away down the tunnel, claws hanging at their sides. The mage handed the Miracle back to Glissa, who slipped the heavy chain over her head. The artifact was awkward and would make swordplay difficult, but she didn't have much choice. She scooped up Gef's bag and slung it onto her back, and placed a hand on Brenna's shoulder. I have to go, Glissa said. Tell them about the Nym. It might be enough. Get the children out of here. The mountain shook again, causing the children to scream in unison again, and almost knocked Glissa off her feet. She stumbled backwards into a pair of waiting arms. As the tremor subsided, the elf girl turned to see who had caught her. You weren't going to say goodbye, Lies asked. Lies, what are you doing here? Glissa demanded. Catching you, her sister replied, and checking in on the children. But it appears you've saved them already, big sister. Always looking out for me. Something about the way Lies said big sister didn't sound right, but Glissa didn't dwell on it. My Kana, Yert is dead. We have a chance to turn the tide, but Glissa must go, Brenna said. I know, Lies replied and wrapped Glissa in a tight embrace. There, now you can go. Come back as soon as you can. I will, Lies. Now, get these kids someplace safe. Good luck, both of you, Glissa said. And you, but none of us should rely solely on luck, Brenna said.